3 true, disturbing camping horror stories. Story 1. I've always enjoyed going on at least a few camping trips each year. I usually used to go later in the season, so the crowds wouldn't be as big in my area. Things calm down quite a bit after September, when the kids go back to school. I'm a 32-year-old single man, so I don't have to worry about that. All this happened at the end of September. It was my 4th or 5th trip of the year up to that point. It was generally considered pretty safe to hit the trails in my area, but things occasionally go wrong. I had heard news of a missing hiker several weeks before this incident. According to the news, the guy disappeared without a trace, no sign of his equipment or anything. Only his car was found at the trailhead. It's the kind of thing that happens once every few years, so I decided to go out anyway. This time I was with my friend Samuel, who is also my brother-in-law. We decided to go for a shorter trail that I had already done a few times before. It would be a 2 or 3 day trip in the mountains with great views and lots of good camping spots along the way. Since I already knew the trail, we didn't have to do much planning. I just packed my things and stocked up enough food to get through the trip. We got in my truck and headed there. It was only an hour from my home in the city, so it wasn't too remote or anything like that. When we got to the trailhead, there were a few other cars, but it was still pretty empty for that area, with so much traffic. It seemed unlikely that we would see another person while we were there. We both grabbed our backpacks and started walking along the trail. It was around 11:30 in the morning, and it was cloudy. The forecast was for rain, but we hadn't seen a single drop yet. That wouldn't have stopped us anyway. Once you're there, there's no going back. Park rangers can come in an emergency, but otherwise, if you go in, you go out. After about 3 hours of hiking, we saw a campsite off to the side. There was a new North Face store with a steaming fire next door. I thought it was strange because it was too early to prepare for the night and too late to still be there from the night before. Most people wouldn't stay there for a whole day, especially so close to the entrance. However, it wasn't enough to worry about, so I didn't even mention it to Samuel. We just kept walking. After another few hours, the sun was setting, so we decided to stop for the night. There were no great spots, so we just chose a small clearing off the trail. It wasn't a great camping site, but there was a campfire there, so we knew it had already been used. Samuel and I lit a fire, had dinner, and went to bed early. When we woke up in the morning, we were surprised to see that the North Face tent was set up right next to ours in the small clearing. That was incredibly strange because none of us heard anything during the night. We packed our things and got ready. When we were almost done, a man came out of the woods. He came up to me and introduced himself. Although he was scared before, he seemed like a pretty normal guy for the most part. He was around our age, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a blue and gray jacket with some sort of logo on it, and also had Pete's name embroidered on the front. He must have used it for work. I thought the guy had an uneven beard with long hair and was about 6 feet tall. He said he had been there for a few days and was on his way outside. However, 2 things caught my attention. First of all, his jacket was at least 2 sizes too big for him, and I also noticed a small blood stain on his neck near the hood. None of those things are irrefutable proof. Cuts and scrapes can occur for all sorts of reasons in that location, but it made me a little suspicious. Like I said, the guy was friendly, so we just chatted for a few minutes and then went our separate ways. Samuel and I kept walking further inside for the rest of the day. This time we stopped earlier because there was a nice spot by a stream. I always like the sound of running water when I sleep, so I really wanted to stop there. After setting everything up and having dinner, we sat by the fire talking for several hours. We went to sleep around midnight. I fell asleep quickly to the soothing sound of the stream nearby. At some point during the night, a scream woke me up. It was Samuel. Her shop was right next to mine. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 4 in the morning. I unzipped my tent to take a look. I pointed my flashlight at night and saw a man running. He was the man from before, with the big jacket in the North Face store. Samuel said the man was loitering around our camp and tried to open his tent. We were both scared of that guy. Something wasn't right with him, and we both knew it. Since it was almost dawn, we got up and decided to start walking as soon as the sun rose. That way, we would go back without having to spend another night there. Fortunately, we managed to return without seeing the stranger again. When we got back to my truck, we loaded up our things and headed to the police station in the nearby town. I sat down with Samuel and one of the officers to give them a description of the man. I told them that the guy was in his 30s, about 6 feet tall, wearing a gray and blue jacket with Pete's name on it, and I also told them about his yellow North Face store. The officer looked surprised. He looked away, stood up, and excused himself. After 2 or 3 minutes, he came back and told us that the jacket and tent we described matched perfectly those of a man who disappeared on another trail weeks earlier. So, we had found a missing person. Samuel asked the officer, who shook his head ominously and told us that the missing person was a 60-year-old man who was 6 feet tall. That's when we realized that the man we saw was likely connected to the disappearance. So far, neither the missing man nor the stranger have been found. I still go there every year, but it definitely makes me think twice about going somewhere alone. I'm glad I had Samuel with me that time. A single person is much easier. Story 2. This happened about 3 years ago, during one of my phases of small road trips that I had when I moved to a big city from my hometown in the South. It was the week of spring break in 2018, and my teenage antics were at an all-time high because I was a sophomore in high school. My friends and I were pretty avid users of alcohol. Not that I promoted its use or anything. We were just teenagers at the time. I had just made the trip back to my hometown and was relaxing at my friend's house when he said we should go on a camping trip for fun, since I was there for the holidays. By the way, my friend's name is Dylan, and our other friends we invited on the trip were Lucas and Valentino. My name is Eric. Dylan had found a really cool camping spot by a lake that neither I, Lucas, nor Valentino had ever been to before. I'm a nature lover, and I was excited about the whole situation. I had no idea what was in store for us. We decided to leave early in the morning. We packed a couple of beers and a couple bottles of liquor in a cooler with our other camping gear. This was a small town, so getting those things was as easy as taking a candy from a baby. Since I was the only one with a license at the time, it was my responsibility to drive. Since I was staying with Dylan, that meant we only had to pick up Lucas and Valentino on the road. We began the 45-minute drive from where the city was located. We were listening to music from unknown rappers and carefree trap music, which all the teenagers were listening to at the time. Although I wish I had better taste in music, we passed the trees that meandered along the sides of the road leading out of the city. They enveloped the sunlight that shone above with their tall, spreading branches. We leave the forest towards an opening of crop fields on both sides. We were following an old road that had a fork. One direction led to the highway, and the other to an older and smaller town than ours. That was the one that led us where we were going without a second thought. I put up the turn signal, and then we turned onto the road opposite the highway, which led to the much denser and darker forest. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, as did the others, but it was much more noticeable. We barely had enough sunlight to not turn on the headlights. The road turned to dirt, and rocks could be heard bouncing off the sides of the tires. We passed the first houses and immediately noticed something strange. It wasn't that they were old caravans or anything like that. It was just that they all had these little tin chimneys that were blowing smoke into the air. It was the beginning of spring, so it wasn't even that cold. We continue along the old dirt road that led to the lake. After passing the rest of the houses along the way, we noticed that almost all the other houses had the same chimneys that were smoking from the top. We arrived at the place near the lake, and it was really a cool place. It was the only place that had a bit of an opening between the trees. One side of the dirt road leading to our place circled around, and in the middle was a small patch of grass with 3 small trees around it. I parked my car next to the center of the circle and decided to pitch our tent near the patch. Our future bonfire would be in the middle of the patch. We split into 2 groups. Dylan and I went to collect firewood while Lucas and Valentino collected stones to dig a well. Dylan and I headed in the opposite direction of the lake, where the dense forest awaited us. As we collected firewood, Dylan casually looked up from his task. He saw something ahead in the tall grass that almost overhung our shoulders at this point. "Do you see that rusty old truck up there?" asked Dylan. I looked up and saw it. "You mean that old rust bucket?" I replied. Yes, I see it. I wonder who left him here. We casually collected the rest of the firewood and returned to the campsite. Dusk was beginning to fall, and it was time for us to open the cooler full of liquor. We sat by the crackling fire. We sat in a circle telling horrible horror stories and failed attempts to win over women, all while laughing and having a good time. We sipped our beers and took out the drinks. The darkness around the fire and surrounding forests had completely settled in at this point. We were all pretty drunk too. We walked in a straight line around the fire, acting as if we could pass a sobriety test. Dylan fell next to a log we were sitting on, and so did Lucas. Valentino did the same. Although I wasn't exactly understanding the impromptu sobriety test, I kept tripping and falling next to them as they laughed at my effort. "Shut up, guys, give me a break," I said, taking a deep, long breath. I immediately felt a sudden urge to vomit, so I told them I would be back right away. They laughed even louder, as they knew what I was going to do. I managed to get to where the tall grass was and let my stomach do the talking. I didn't notice how dark the surrounding area really was until I was done. I turned around to see the camp in the distance, which looked like a small speck. At that moment, I heard a noise in the bushes and, with my phone in hand, I turned on the flashlight to see what was causing the commotion. I was so drunk at the time that I literally had no thoughts on my mind. Feeling curious, I decided to investigate. I went a little deeper into the tall grass, with the dark branches stalking me everywhere. I stumbled upon what appeared to be a rock. I almost let out a scream until I calmed down and ignored him. I raised my flashlight to see what it was, and lo and behold, it was the front tire of that truck that Dylan and I found earlier. I turned up the flashlight a bit more to get a better view of the entire truck and its layout. It was a rusty green Ford, probably from the 90s or something, with a raised bed cover that had windows on all sides and cracked glass on almost all of them. It seemed like it had been sitting there idle for a good 10 years without moving. I raised the flashlight a little more to the front of the cockpit and looked inside. I saw old newspapers, crushed beer cans, and, strangely, a few needles lying on the floor. That's when my curiosity calmed down a bit, and fear began to take hold of me. I turned my attention to the sound coming from the back of the cockpit. I slowly walked with the leaves and crunchy grass under my feet. I reached the back of the cabin and tremblingly raised my flashlight to the window. When I did, my heart sank into complete terror. What was looking through the glass at me was a man. He had eyes without pupils and a smile that only a man on the verge of sanity could make. He was banging his arms against the glass, and the sound of the impact made me fly backwards. I frantically grabbed my phone from the floor and, without a second thought, pointed the light back at the man, only to see him bang on the window much harder. His arms were bleeding, his shirt was torn, and his face was scarred. His eyes began to stick out of their sockets and he laughed horribly, then began to cry hysterically. I let out a heart-wrenching scream and my heart raced for a minute. I wasted no time and quickly turned around to run back to camp. I turned around to see the man get out of the truck. He turned to look at me, tilting his head with a murderous smile and deep white eyes that glowed as he began to walk toward me. My race became a desperate race, and I ended up crashing into the campfire. The fire was about to be extinguished and almost extinguished, but my pants had caught fire a little. I fell to the ground and rolled until it went out. "Eric, what the hell is going on?" shouted Dylan. I looked at my three friends who were completely in shock. They were still completely oblivious to what was in the woods right next to us. "There's a man in the woods and that truck. The truck we found," I said as fast as I could. Then our attention shifted to the truck in the tall grass. Two headlights flashed from the grass, and the truck's engine roared furiously to life. All our hearts sank and we sobered instantly. "Get in the car, Lucas," he shouted. Valentino and I looked at each other in agreement, then ran to the car and locked the doors as soon as we got in. We were breathing hard and shaking. We all agreed to start the car and get out of there as soon as possible. We started the car only to find that the truck's headlights began to surround us around the campground. I stepped on the gas pedal and left there, leaving behind the store and the alcohol because at that moment it didn't matter anymore. The trees seemed to have grown 30 meters higher and now surrounded us completely. The truck behind us was almost touching my bumper, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the man one last time. His eyes were fixed on mine as if to say, "I will kill you." His pupils didn't exist like they used to, and his smile seemed even more forced. He was laughing to the point of madness. I thought it was the end for us. Suddenly, we left the dark forest and entered the open fields of the farm from before. The truck behind us braked sharply, and we could hear the screech of its tires so loud that we felt like our eardrums had burst. I looked in the mirror and saw the truck slowly backing up into the forest it came from, and the darkness swallowed it up again. We didn't play music for the rest of the way home, nor did we talk a word to each other about what had happened. We arrive at Dylan's path, and when we leave, we breathe a sigh of relief. Each went to his shed, where he was staying. We all grabbed water and some food to calm down. We watched some comedies and tried to get the events that had happened out of our minds. Because of the constant laughs from the movies and shows we watched, I had to go outside. I thought I was having a panic attack. All I could hear was the man's laughter. I shook my head and took a deep breath, then went back inside. I still keep in touch with these friends, even after he finished high school. They're still my closest friends and probably always will be. I will never forget the pure whites of that man's eyes and his murderous smile. One thing that still bothers me to this day is that Dylan and I noticed that truck very early. That man had been watching us all along. Story 3. I like to go camping from time to time. It's very popular where I live, and there are many good places within walking distance. So it's very easy to go on a trip with little to no planning. I usually go alone or with my dog Henry, who is named after my grandfather. I was tired of some of the nearby trails, so once I decided to go a little further. It was about a 2-hour drive for me, but Henry and I finally came to a trail I'd never done before. I had my ultralight tent and just enough supplies for a single night. Although I was light, I did carry my pistol as protection against bears, which is highly recommended in my area. I'd be absolutely devastated if I had to use it, but it's better than me. It was a Saturday, and I had to be back at work on Monday, so it was going to be just a quick one-night out. We started hiking the trail around noon, planning to hike for several hours and hopefully find a decent spot before it got dark. It was early spring, which in my area means a lot of rain, so there weren't many people around. Fortunately for us, it was clear, although that could change in an instant. I didn't expect to see anyone, but after an hour and a half I saw a man on the trail ahead of us. He was a little older than me, probably in his 40s or 50s, and he was completely alone. He was going slowly, so it wasn't long before Henry and I were hot on his heels. When we were close, I said, "Hey, dude, we're coming from behind." The guy turned to look, then turned as if he didn't even care. It's common on the trail to yield to faster hikers, so I was surprised. I didn't let it bother me, though. As soon as the trail widened, we passed it. I nodded to him and said hello on the way, but I didn't get a reply. The guy gave me a bad feeling, but he was behind us and we were faster, so I thought he was gone. Around 7 p.m., I found a good place to camp for the night. He had a fire pit already built with a log to sit on. I set up camp while Henry ran around and scouted the area. After about 10 minutes, he returned. Henry had his head down like he was in trouble. You know, the thing dogs do sometimes. I wasn't sure what to think, but something seemed strange. For the rest of the night, he stood by my side, almost moaning. He was scared to death and had no idea why. Sometimes I think dogs can perceive things that we can't. I also thought that maybe I had seen something while running before. We sat around the fire for a few hours after dinner. Around midnight, Henry and I went to the store and tried to sleep. I fell asleep at some point, but I don't remember when. I woke up when it was still dark, and when I checked my watch I saw that it was just before 1 a.m. So I hadn't slept much. Henry was moaning and licking my face. That's what woke me up. I stroked his head and tried to calm him down, but he didn't fall back asleep. That's when I heard footsteps outside. They were unmistakable human footsteps, slow and deliberate, which could be heard and approached. Before long, they were right next to our store, circling us. I think I even heard him touch the outer cover of my tent. I froze there, and Henry was breathing slowly. That's when we heard a man laugh in a really creepy way. He was somewhere between a laugh and a cough, almost as if he was trying to stop himself from laughing, but he couldn't contain himself. For a moment, I was almost sure he was that guy from before. I didn't say anything, but the man could surely hear Henry moaning. I definitely knew we were there. After a minute, I came to my senses and reached for my pistol. I pulled it out and felt the cold metal in my hand. It wasn't charged, so I took out the charger and put it in, making that unmistakable noise. As soon as I did that, I heard something that still makes my hair stand on end every time I think about it. The man said, "Ah, okay," then walked away. Neither Henry nor I slept the rest of the night, and thankfully, the man never returned. As soon as the sun came up, I got up and started to dismantle my tent. He wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. That's when I noticed something. There was a slit in my shop right at the top. I was sure I wasn't there before. I have no doubt in my mind that the man did it. We hurriedly walked out of there as soon as we picked everything up. When I got home, I thought about calling the police, even though I didn't think they could do anything. I called them and reported it. I never heard another word about it, but it's always on my mind whenever I'm on the trail.